Most people assume that being ghosted is easier than being rejected. You never have to sit through an uncomfortable conversation. Nobody says anything cruel. You just stop hearing from someone. And at some point, presumably, you move on. This assumption turns out to be wrong in a way that researchers did not fully expect. When scientists actually compared the two experiences, ghosting versus direct rejection, they found something surprising. The pain levels were identical, but the people who had been ghosted were still checking the other person's social media a week later. The rejected ones had already started moving on. The difference was not how much it hurt. The difference was what the brain did with it afterward. To understand why, you need to understand something about how the brain processes unfinished things. There is a well-documented phenomenon in psychology called the Zeigarnik effect. It describes the brain's tendency to hold on to incomplete tasks more strongly than completed ones. Waiters remember orders that haven't been paid yet. Students remember the exam questions they couldn't answer. And people remember the relationships that ended without explanation. Not because those relationships were more important, but because the brain never received a signal that they were over. Ghosting is, essentially, the Zeigarnik effect applied to human connection. The other person left, but they didn't close the file, and your brain, being the obsessive record keeper that it is, keeps the file open, keeps returning to it, keeps looking for the missing information that would allow it to finally put the thing away. A 2025 study published in the journal Personal Relationships followed people through the early stages of dating and tracked what happened when contact suddenly stopped. The findings were uncomfortable to read, mostly because they were so recognizable. People who had been ghosted reported the same drop in self-esteem and the same levels of emotional distress as people who had received an explicit rejection. The pain, measured carefully and scientifically, was equal. But then the behavior diverged. People who had been rejected started, slowly, to process what had happened. They had something to work with, a reason, an ending, a story that made sense even if it was painful. The ghosted group did something different. They reached out. They sent messages into the silence. They checked profiles. They looked for signs of life. 24 hours after the last contact, ghosted participants were significantly more likely to still be trying to re-establish connection, not because they were more emotionally fragile, but because their brain had not yet accepted that the situation was resolved. It was still waiting, still hopeful, still in some quiet corner, expecting a reply. There is a 2026 study from Baylor University that took this further and found something that most people would not predict. Being ghosted measurably affected sleep quality. Not just mood, not just self-esteem, sleep. The body's nightly recovery process was disrupted by the unresolved nature of the experience. The researchers connected this to belongingness theory, which describes the human need for stable, meaningful social bonds as a fundamental biological drive. Not a preference, not a personality trait, but something closer to a need for food or shelter. When that need is suddenly and inexplicably cut off, the body responds accordingly. It stays alert. It does not fully rest. It keeps, on some physiological level, listening for the reply that isn't coming. Which means that being ghosted is not just emotionally difficult. It is physically difficult. Your body is working on it while you sleep. So why do people do it? The most common explanation, when ghosters are asked directly, is conflict avoidance. They didn't want to say something hurtful. They thought disappearing was cleaner than explaining. They assumed the other person would eventually understand and move on without needing to hear anything specific. This reasoning has a certain logic to it, if you think about it from the inside. Difficult conversations are genuinely uncomfortable. Saying, "I'm not interested," to someone who is interested in you requires a tolerance for awkwardness that not everyone has developed. Disappearing asks nothing of you. You just stop responding and let time do the work. The problem is that time cannot do the work. Not without information. The human mind does not interpret silence as a clear message. It interprets silence as an unclear one, and then spends considerable energy trying to decode it. A direct rejection, even a clumsy one, even a painful one, gives the other person something concrete to respond to. It closes the Zeigarnik loop. It lets the brain file the experience away and begin, however slowly, to move on. Silence does the opposite. It keeps everything suspended. There is one more thing worth knowing, and it is perhaps the most counterintuitive finding in this area of research. Ghosting does not just affect how you feel about the person who disappeared. It affects how you feel about yourself, and it does this in a specific way that direct rejection typically does not. When someone rejects you directly, the rejection has a context. You weren't compatible. The timing was wrong. They were looking for something different. These explanations are painful, but they are external. They say something about the situation, not about your fundamental worth as a person. When someone ghosts you, there is no context. There is only silence. And into that silence, the mind begins to project. Maybe I talked too much. Maybe I wasn't interesting enough. Maybe there is something about me, something I can't see from the inside but that is immediately obvious to everyone else, that makes me someone people eventually leave without explanation. This is not a rational process, but it is an extremely common one, and it explains why people who have been ghosted multiple times often develop a particular kind of anxiety around new relationships, not because they are weak, but because their brain has started to treat silence as evidence. The practical question, eventually, is what to do with all of this. Researchers are careful here. They do not suggest that closure requires the other person to come back and explain themselves. That would be convenient, but it is not realistic, and waiting for it tends to make things worse rather than better. What they suggest instead is something more internal. Closure is not a conversation. It is a decision. It is the decision to acknowledge that something happened, that it affected you, that you are allowed to feel that without needing it to be officially confirmed by the person who caused it. The brain wants to keep the file open until it receives new information, but you can override that. You can decide, without anyone's permission, that the file is closed, that the story ended, even without a final scene, that you don't need the last line to know how it ends. Ghosting is painful not because of what it does, but because of what it refuses to do. It refuses to end things with any dignity. It refuses to acknowledge that your time and attention had value. It removes your ability to respond, to react, to close things on your own terms. But here is what it cannot remove: your ability to decide at some point that you are done waiting. Most people reach that point eventually. They just reach it quietly without telling anyone. Which, if you think about it, is a kind of ghosting in reverse.